with Damon Jacobs. Damon, thank you so much for joining me.
I'm so happy to see you again. Well, to see you. Like, we've talked before on the phone or online, but we haven't, like, to actually get to see you and have a conversation.
It's much better. People have been telling me that forever. I thought that I wouldn't be able to have a good conversation this way but at the time I talked to you, I always had notes in front of me. And at some point I realized that having notes in front of you actually is what makes for a bad conversation. So now it's just easy. I love seeing people and talking to them, and it's nice to see you.
Great to see you too.
So there's so much to talk about. You hit on a few keynotes, but before we started chatting, that I would like to talk about too. Last time we spoke, we were talking about two things: PrEP and vaping.
Yeah.
And I just gotten off the phone with somebody who writes for Reason, and they were talking about vaping and harm reduction, making some good points. And then it was the best I've ever heard. It was the best reasons for vaping as harm reduction that I had ever heard at that point. So maybe you could retell some of that and talk about what your work is, how it's focused in that area right now.
Absolutely. So I think it is even more of a hot, controversial topic now than it was 3 years ago when we talked about this, mainly because of misunderstandings and miscommunication in the US. Oh my goodness, is there miscommunication about public health issues in the US? Who would think such a thing? But there really has been. So let's just be clear about something. Vaping means an electronic means by which to deliver nicotine into the system. And I know you and a lot of your watchers and listeners know that nicotine is a drug that often we become addicted to, and in and of itself, in its purest form, is not considered to be harmful. No more harmful than caffeine. It is a stimulant. It often enhances mood. It often helps a lot of people with concentration and focus. And, you know, in and of itself is not a harmful drug. This is why the FDA wants people to chew nicotine gum or wear a nicotine patch if they're addicted. But where the danger comes in and where the harm comes in is when you mix nicotine with tar and carcinogens. And that's basically the basis of a traditional cigarette, is that you put the drug nicotine into this tubular thing with lots of tar, lots of tobacco, lots of carcinogens, and then you set it on fire so that all of these ingredients come exploding into your body all at the same time, which again can feel very satisfying. That's why people do it, is because oftentimes it feels very satisfying. But what happens if you take away the tar, the tobacco, the carcinogens, and you deliver nicotine into the system in a way that is much safer, that doesn't burn, but heats? Vaping offers that option. Now, vaping is not without carcinogens. I want to be clear. Vaping does have carcinogens, and putting carcinogens into your body is never necessarily a healthy thing. But the reason why vaping is considered harm reduction, and the Public Health England government recommends vaping over cigarettes, is because it's 95% estimated less harmful, because there are 95% less carcinogens in vaping products than in a traditional cigarette.
Does the math cash out that way? 95% fewer carcinogens equals 95% safer in some way?
That is Public Health England's reasoning on that.
Yeah.
Not because there's zero carcinogens in vaping. And it's so hard because vaping isn't regulated. So there's no, like, different vaping products have different carcinogens, which is why it gets fuzzy. But no matter what, there's going to be less in a vaping product than in a traditional cigarettes. Traditional cigarettes have thousands of carcinogens. Vaping products are believed to have much, much fewer, 95% less than that, according to Public Health England. And even our own FDA sort of reluctantly acknowledged in the winter of 2018 that if they sort of have this thing on their page that if you really can't stop, if you really have to smoke, if you cannot, you know, they're sort of shaming about it, but they're like, if you really can't stop smoking, vaping is a safer alternative.
If you have to be a piece of shit, then you
really can't, if you have no impulse control. And, so again, in harm reduction, we don't judge. We meet people where they are, and we try to help them make healthier decisions based on where they're at and what they need today. And in that frame, vaping is a much safer product to consume than traditional tobacco cigarettes. And last time I talked to you, we were kind of on this path of helping Americans understand that in a way the rest of the world, well, at least many other parts of the world, had already adapted, had already become accustomed to. But now there were a few things along the way that really, can I curse on, am I allowed to?
Yeah, please.
A few things happened that really fucked that up. One was that Juul got involved in the game in 2000. And after they got involved, there was no longer legitimacy to the argument that I could make that teenagers were less likely to adapt nicotine practices through vaping. Up until then, we had the data through the CDC that showed that teenagers had been increasing vaping, but they had been decreasing cigarette use.
Right.
So that there hadn't been a significant increase in nicotine consumption amongst teenagers. And I could have safely have said that to you truthfully 3 years ago when we spoke. Because Juul got into the game, they started to market nicotine consumption in a very strategic way to young adults and teenagers in a way that created desire for a product that hadn't been there before. Teenagers did go way up the charts in vaping. And you could make a fair argument and a decent argument that most of those teenagers, or at least a lot of them, never would have picked up a nicotine product in the first place had it not been marketed to them in the way that it was, as something that was like tasted good. And there really wasn't a lot of accountability in Juul's marketing to show that this is, when you purchase this, you're going to be consuming a nicotine product. And this is the effect that nicotine has on the brain. And it is very, very addictive. A lot of teenagers say that they started using Juul and they didn't know that. So by the time they figured that out, they had become very addicted to it. And now they have this nicotine addiction. So that really messed up the efforts by harm reduction specialists like myself to try to introduce vaping to adults in the US, adults who had already been smoking, who had tried to quit many, many times and had not been able to stop consuming nicotine over and over again and felt very guilty and frustrated and disempowered by that. That was whom vaping was a very, very harm reduction and healthier option. Not healthy, but healthier. Now you got the kids involved. Now you got the teens involved. Now you've got hysteria in America involved, and you've got all the parents involved. And this is why anti-vaping legislation has passed in major cities all across the US, is because of this alarmist reaction to teenagers getting addicted to nicotine who arguably would not have gotten addicted otherwise.
Harm reductionists are in a strange position this way in a lot of ways. You can't prove the safety of something, really, because you always have to have the possibility that something's going to be affect you in a bad way. So already you're on a back foot for anything harm reduction, and especially for vaping. And the way you just talked about it being marketed, Juul being marketed, it reminds me of like if TikTok was a platform, but before kids started using it, you told adults, this could be a great marketing tool for you, or something like that. Then tons of adults would probably use it. But it's just now it looks annoying because tons of kids use it, and it's marketed so that kids who are more social will talk to other kids and get attention from them. This reminds me of the trend that vaping is going down. So the annoying part of it is the marketing and the status signaling, and that's probably even the addictive part of it too. The ritual and status more so than the nicotine itself. Fair framing so far?
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't, again, this seems unique to America, and I open that up if I'm not correct in this. In most other parts of the world, there's a recognition that we can help adults stay alive and protect children at the same time. We can do two things at once. In America, no, there's absolutely no both. There's no and or both. It's either or. You either protect the kids and let the adults, those dirty smokers, let them die.
Yeah.
I believe you can do both. I believe that there are ways to protect and prevent nicotine consumption at the very beginning, from children, from teenagers. There were already regulations in place that do work when they're enforced, that stop kids from being able to buy vaping products, to buy nicotine products under the age of 21. You can check for ID. You can make sure that licensed, safe realtors are nowhere within a certain mileage of schools. That was already happening, and that was effective. But now in this country, there's this whole thing. It's like, well, because kids have already gotten into vaping, we have to ban vaping products. And that means adults can't use them either to stay alive. And I disagree with that paradigm. I'm like, that is ridiculous. You can help adults stay alive, and you can protect kids at the same time.
So this is what I like about you. I feel like I don't have to set anything up really. I could just give you kind of like an intellectual alley-oop. But will you say things, because you already do, that will make anti-vapors happy right now? And then, but can you extend that argument to what you're talking about? You know, how can those things be true, and how can we protect kids and adults at the same time?
Yeah, there are ways to do that, and that was happening again before the Juul thing came into vogue. You could see on the CDC's own website that they had a direct inverse relationship of nicotine use. Yes, vaping had gone up, but smoking had gone down. It was a direct inverse relationship. That means that kids were generally using nicotine, but pretty much at the same rates.
Right.
Now you can't make that argument because the numbers of kids using nicotine products is so high, arguably high. So I do see that side of the argument. I still firmly believe that there is not a justification in denying a product to adults that can help them have a better quality and quantity of life, just because you're worried about the kids. So that was the first thing, Juul, in 2018. And the second thing that really fucked up the progress were the lung injuries that took place throughout the summer and fall of 2019. So that was where we were learning and didn't know what to make of it, but the media was making a lot of the fact that there were many, many people, mostly young adults, that were using vaping products and getting quite sick, some of them tragically dying, and that this was really an epidemic in this country. I know with COVID, that seems like forever ago, but in the summer of 2000, the summer fall of 2019, that was a really big deal. And it wasn't clear as to how and why that was happening, but we did know that the cause was a vaping product. What we came to learn, what we came to understand, was that this was happening because of a vaping product that was being made and sold on the internet that had an ingredient called vitamin E acetate that is quite deadly if inhaled or heated or burned into the lungs. This was not coming from retail vaping shops. This was not coming from the shops where responsible owners and sellers were selling vaping products. This was almost all coming from dealers online, selling this product online. And the overwhelming majority, I believe the FDA eventually said about 86% or more of these products were THC products, not nicotine products. Some had both. Some had THC and nicotine. But the majority, almost nearly every person who was injured and tragically died of the vitamin E acetate product was consuming THC, not nicotine. Now, that is a distinction that I don't think got out into the echelons of the public, but it's on the FDA website. Once all was said and done, the FDA made a public statement that they put out in February of 2020. Again, I know that seems like forever ago, but it was less than a year ago. Before COVID happened, the FDA came to a resolution and made that public. People didn't read it. People didn't talk about it. The media didn't talk about it. So it's still believed, even in many harm reduction circles, that nicotine products were what caused the lung injuries. And that is fundamentally not true.
So I remember watching that, and I thought I thought of you and others and thought you were probably going into apoplexy watching the media portray this as, this is a horrible epidemic. This is and, even if you're not a harm reductionist, you can know that the media likes to tell stories before the facts are in. And so, it doesn't surprise me. It shouldn't surprise anybody that the story was out there, the narrative was painted, but it can't be walked back even if we have the information.
Right. And so that set us up. These two things really set us up for this very sad storm, that COVID itself being so devastating and traumatic, and that's awful. But one of the ways that COVID causes harm in the body is by attacking the lungs and the respiratory system. If you're a smoker of cigarettes and you get COVID, your chances are much less than, or your body's ability to fight that off, your respiratory system not to shut down, are significantly impaired. And I don't know exactly how much. I don't think we have the data yet. But we know that if people have already smoked cigarettes and they're routine smokers and then they get COVID, it's going to be much, much harder to recover. The question I have, and we don't really have data yet, is does vaping make a difference? If someone's been using a harm reduction product, if they've been heating, not burning, then the lungs are going to be in much better shape. Maybe not perfect pink shape, but they're going to be in better shape. And it seems to me logical to say, and again, I look forward to seeing the data when it comes out, when we know more, but it seems to me very theoretically possible that someone who has consumed nicotine vaping products free of vitamin E acetate, a product that they have bought and consumed from a licensed seller, that they have been in a much better position to fight COVID when they have been afflicted with COVID. And again, I really do want to see what that looks like.
Can I go back to, I remember what I was going to say now when we were talking about high school, people in the US dying or getting these terrible lung conditions. It seems like it would be fair to say, to assume, or to at least ask the question, that part of the reason, if really what was going on was that people, these things were being used not as intended, and then that's when people were being harmed. That first of all, the information that we give people about it was faulty because we're not willing to acknowledge that people use it, or that they possibly could in safer or less safe ways, and that our unwillingness to acknowledge that also pushed people to making decisions about it that they wouldn't have had the proper information, or the ability to say, just come out and say, hey, I'm doing this.
Yeah, I mean, I was in some of those hearings in San Francisco and New York,
right,
where the city was voting to ban nicotine products based on the Juul epidemic. And in both places, you had all these kids talking to all these, city council people, and they were continuing to say, I didn't know this was a nicotine product, and I didn't know what a nicotine product was, and I didn't know it was addictive or it could be harmful. Okay, I'm not going to say that anyone isn't being upfront, but I will take it. I heard it enough times that I will say that there's something to it. And I can imagine, as a teenager, I mean, I remember, like, for me in the 80s, it was like clove cigarettes. It's like, there was some belief that clove cigarettes weren't as dangerous as regular cigarettes. And I think it turned out to be the opposite. But, when you're a kid, you really don't know that stuff. You're not doing a lot of investigating. You're just like, oh, this is fun. I can hide this from my teachers. I can be secretive from adults. And when you're a kid, it's always fun to be secretive from adults. And all my friends are doing it, and it tastes good, and I kind of get a little high when I do it. So I can see how alluring that was to kids on so many levels.
When I was that age, I had two sets of books. One that was me with my peers, and one was me in the eyes of adults. And I really wanted to hold the values that adults wanted me to hold. And I just thought I was doing terrible things if I did something like smoking. I imagine people, well, don't have to imagine. I work with high school students, and they've talked to me. They feel the same way. And so, just the idea in your mind that you're doing something wrong, and then the information, false information, that when you're vaping, you're doing something just as harmful as smoking. There's no scale to it. I can imagine that makes things 10 times worse. That your subsequent behaviors will likely be, on a population level, a lot worse than your initial ones.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I really, we've said, what if every young adult, every teenager could get rational, fact-based, empirically driven data about smoking, about alcohol, about drugs, about heroin, about cocaine, about sex. What if we taught kids how to be, here's the facts, here's what we know. Individual experience may vary, but this is what could be potentially harmful about this. And there are things about this that could be potentially joyful if used in a responsible way. There's things about these, there's experiences here that might actually hold something for you in your learning if you use them as a tool of growth and learning. But if you don't give kids any information or any guidance or any data, then they just do it. And as you know, they often do so in a way that becomes addictive and abusive and harmful.
So that thanks for leading us back into the conversation about COVID. I'm not optimistic. I know you seem pretty optimistic of a person by nature. I'll say I'm pessimistic that we can give the kind of messaging that would account for the possibility of vaping being a lesser option and actually perhaps saving lives, that actually being a measure. If somebody's smoking and they want to help their risks against COVID, and vaping actually could help, we're not even going to want to look into that. There's only a small subset of researchers that maybe want to go that route because it's difficult to get funded. I might be getting on my hobby horse here, but you're not going to win a popularity contest for doing it. So
I agree. I don't know if we're ever going to see that data. I really don't know, but I think it's I think it's a valuable question, and I don't know if we'll ever get an empirically driven answer to that.
Now, you mentioned before we talked that something that's been going on in your mind is how public health officials could have taken a harm reduction approach when addressing the public. I think it sounds like we're singing the same song here, but I know you'll have an articulate way of talking about that. Tell me what you mean.
So if we look now, I mean, even when it was happening, I could see the way the mask issue was being communicated, and it was all around the worst possible way you could communicate a public health strategy, because it was overall, all of it was should on both sides. On the people telling you to do it, on the people telling you not to do it.
It's true.
It was made into a moral issue. Preventing COVID and masks, it's not a moral issue, it's a medical issue. There are, and masks are not a guarantee. They're not protection from COVID. They are a harm reduction strategy that reduce one's risk of acquiring COVID and transmitting COVID. Now, in the harm reduction world, we're very accustomed to these messages. It's not all or nothing. It's reducing the likelihood of something harmful happening. So we take precautions based on reducing harm. Well, the rest of the world doesn't really get, at least, okay, the rest of the United States really seem to be struggling with this issue, partly because it was communicated so horribly by political officials and medical officials who just didn't seem to know how to give this message that is both and versus all or nothing.
They don't have the language for it. I mean, they just don't have the practice in doing it, as you've demonstrated in the last topic.
Right. And it's still happening to this day. Now it's become such a dichotomy between the people who wear masks and the people who don't. It's become an issue where people have dug in so deeply on both sides that there's so little room now to have these conversations. It was like, I grew up in the 80s and the message was just say no to drugs, just say no. You either don't do drugs or you're this horrible addict on the street. There's absolutely no in between. Consequently, there were a lot of people who tried drugs, liked drugs, and had good experiences with drugs, and often then became abusive of drugs because they knew no middle ground between these two extremes. And I feel like we've seen that play out so many times. And this year we saw that play out with the mask thing. It is just such an irresponsible, horrible way that for public officials to communicate what could have been such an important life-saving message. And I will say, in the state of New York, I think we did better And I think one of the reasons why we did better is that the communication from Governor Cuomo overall was not one of morality. He really called upon our integrity. He said, you are New Yorkers. He consistently used, you are strong, you are tough, you are loving, you do the right thing. And he constantly was quoting Spike Lee, like, do the right thing.
You guys have an infrastructure for that, it seems. Like anytime shit happens in New York or Boston, I feel like it's like, hey, we are New York. Hey, we're Boston. Yeah. And that's it seems like basically an efficient and good way to do things.
It was a way of calling people in versus calling people out.
Yes.
Of calling upon higher consciousness and identity that we all share in New York as New Yorkers. And I think that was a very effective way to communicate mask wearing and getting people on board with that idea. Now, it still was kind of playing into, it still didn't really address the harm reduction nuances of mask wearing. But at least it showed me, like, okay, that there is a way to communicate a public health message that calls people to be their higher selves.
Yeah.
So to speak, but not to diminish their humanity or put them down or saying you are a horrible, shameful person if you don't do this, or you're some grandiose, saint if you do this.
And you're talking about the messaging, and then we're kind of making claims about it. People tend to fill in the gaps with their own experiences and things. Can you just give an example? There are plenty, but maybe you could give an example of something that was said, and an example of what could have been done differently, or how that could have been demonstrated differently.
Well, I mean, because it became a political hot potato between the left and the right. And that's the worst thing you could ever do with a public health strategy, is to make it a political issue, because now you've got people digging in politically on both sides, making it like, if you wear a mask, you're this liberal hippie. If you don't wear a mask, you're this red state, hick. And when you do that, you are decimating the value of a public health message. It's so dangerous. I think that's partly what happened with COVID. Even in subtle ways, in the media, I am a big fan of Don Lemon, and I think Don Lemon is wonderful in so many ways, but the moralizing that went on around COVID and mask wearing, I think really served to divide that, to dichotomize it, to not have any room for the ambivalence or the in-between that people were struggling with, that still are struggling with, so, and helping them arrive at a healthy decision once you've made it their morality, But
what's something? So when you said that, I'm thinking about the first thing I remember saying this is not going to go well was when public health officials were saying, "Don't wear a mask." It's almost like, "Don't wear a mask, you idiots. It's not going to help you." And then them saying, "All right, we have masks, so wearing masks helps." And I don't think that was really meant to be malicious, but I think what they could have done is something like, look, we are at a deficit of protective equipment for our health officials. One of the reasons we're asking people to stay inside, we need masks for them. If you are, it could be Americans, can you give if you have any equipment, can you give it up? Can you please, whatever you could do not to try to stockpile it, help is on the way. We'll make it available. Right now, we have to give our frontline workers this stuff. And that some people aren't going to listen to you, but, whatever. And instead, they went the route of, trying to be in charge of what's good, what's bad. So when you said there was bad messaging, that's one of the things that popped into my head. Do you have a specific moment or a specific, one specific targeted message that somebody gave that you can remember that you?
Well, I mean, with all respect to Dr. Fauci, but I mean, we have to remember this is a novel virus. So his messaging on masks shifted in April. Yeah. But at the beginning, he was saying what you said. At the beginning of this epidemic, he was saying, don't wear masks. Like, the message from him and from the World Health Organization is that masks won't really do much to protect you unless you have a surgical mask that can really filter the droplets if you come into contact with the droplets. And we need those for the frontline workers. So don't bogart the PPE, because the frontline workers really need it. That was the message early on. And you had Dr. Fauci saying that, and the World Health Organization saying that. So as you said, it's like once that message shifted, it didn't there was no grace or nuance to it. They went directly from one thing to another without walking people through the steps. That's my opinion. That's my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that also created resistance, because it's like, well, yesterday you said this. Now you're saying this. What are you going to say tomorrow? And meanwhile, you're saying this, but the World Health Organization had this on their website till like July. Like, masks don't really do anything. You know, like, unless you, you know, the non-surgical masks don't do much to protect. And of course, now in retrospect, and they were saying at the time, well, true, they don't do much to protect you, but if you have COVID, you could reduce harm by wearing a mask. So if you have it and you don't know it, your droplets will not go out 9 feet. Your droplets will stay within the confines of your own face.
And of course, the idea of everyone wearing one at the same time, you know, reduces risk that much more. You being safer by wearing one is, you know, it's almost like a prisoner's dilemma kind of thing. We all have to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I think once people got on board and really understood the clear medical science, and I think once we saw in New York how fast our rates came down after being the highest in the country, we went to being the lowest in the country, partly because there was such a tie-in and investment in the public. On all sides of the political fence, people were pretty compliant with mask use. And our leadership and regulations were very, very clear at a certain point. So we saw those numbers come down. That to me was effective messaging. That was effective harm reduction happening. We knew that masks wouldn't solve everything, but you know, I remember I was resistant to masks because I believed that this was stupid, and Anthony Fauci was correct at the beginning. And I had a hard time making that mental leap from, oh, there's really no benefit to wearing a mask, to suddenly like there's really a lot of benefit to wearing a mask. But again, once I understood the nuance and the harm reduction, I was just like, well, why did they fucking say harm reduction from the beginning? Because that I would have understood.
Right.
Masks are not going to save. They're not 100%, but they certainly will reduce the likelihood that you will contract and spread COVID to yourself, to another person. I get that language. I would have been on board with that from day one had I heard that.
In retrospect, you know, I don't know if I could have predicted this, but maybe. I mean, you had a little while everyone was glued to their TV screen, hoping, I mean, when everyone thought they could die, everyone was kind of nice to each other. You know, it was thinking, oh, what is this? I'll listen to whatever people are going to say now. How do I help myself and my family? I feel like that was a window of opportunity too. You know, that was one time you could have given a trusted, true message. Things are already sort of feeling chaotic. I don't think it would have made it more chaotic to give a harm reduction message, but I think public health officials and politicians, partly because, as you say, there's a political game that has to be played too. I think everyone was afraid to do it or take the leap to say something like, maybe this, but it could reduce harm if. What do you think it would take? I'm asking you to speculate, but it'd be interesting to know what you think to get people feeling comfortable with that. You know, even I think people that work in the addiction field who know better and know the value of harm reduction feel uncomfortable. Actually, I know because people have asked me this and how to get around it. They feel uncomfortable, say, as clinicians or as people who work in schools, trying to give a harm reduction message, even though they know it's the best thing to do, because they feel like a liability, and they feel like they're not getting to the other side of the equation. Like, well, if something happens, I just given this harm reduction message, and everyone doesn't understand it, so I should just stick to the script. You know, sorry, that was I went off on a tangent, but my question is, what have you seen that works to get people on board with being able to give that messaging and feeling unafraid to, you know, doing it shamelessly?
Well, okay, so we're thinking about kids in school and drugs and talking to the general population about COVID and masks. It's a little bit different.
Okay.
In retrospect, I think with COVID, we had leadership, political leadership from the very beginning that called in all Americans to be Americans, as you said, and to do the right thing as we learned more about ways to reduce harm, to spell it out. This is not 100%, but this is likely to reduce the possibility that you will hurt yourself or another person. You will be less harmful to hurt your grandmother. I think the fear was like, well, if we tell people that, then they're going to go have all these, parties and go crazy and think, oh, as long as I wear a mask, I'll be fine. Well, guess what happened?
Right.
You weren't clear. The leaders weren't clear. People did take the information and they still went off and they had parties and they spread COVID. And
that's why I think the messaging is basically the same. The idea is basically the same, that there's a fear of, who wants to be the one that says, you could do A, B. We acknowledge that you're adults or kids and you need to live your life and do normal things. And so we don't want to stop you from it, but let's just be clear. Like, who wants to be the person who gets the finger pointed back at them for giving that message if something goes awry,
Right. Because if you say nothing, you can't get blamed. Or if you preach abstinence,
right, you can't go wrong.
Even though we know that in practice, if you say nothing or preach abstinence, you're really creating more destructive outcomes.
Yes. Yeah.
So this takes a level of systemic integrity, which we don't really have in this country when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, when it comes to communicating facts and respecting that people have the right to facts and information that can enhance their experience of using drugs if they so choose to do so at all ages. They're set and they're setting. There are ways to be intentional and knowledgeable, and it doesn't protect you from harm, but it certainly reduces the likeliness of harm and enhances the possibility that you may actually grow and learn from an experience you have. Whether that means having sex, whether that means using drugs, that there are ways to do that. And you're probably at some point in your life going to do all of the above. But if you have the knowledge ahead of time to enhance that and reduce harm, then you're going to have better outcomes. And I think if we talked about that in this culture, we would have less addiction. But as you and I know, now you're starting to threaten the addiction industry, and they don't want to be threatened. They're a pretty powerful group. Betty Ford doesn't want to be challenged on this. The abstinence-based models have a pretty strong political hold in this country and a pretty strong financial hold. Anything that we're talking about in terms of nuancing messaging and enhancing the quality and quantity of life and experience and empowerment is threatening to them.
We think we've moved on so much from this 1950s culture where, people have two twin beds that are next to each other and everyone's proper. It doesn't seem we've moved very far from that at all. We just shifted the frame a little bit. It's just different things that we're not willing to actually speak honestly about. Something I like about you is that every time I see any, posts on social media, interviews that you've done, podcasts, blogs, or whatever, you speak very openly about sex, and just in a breath of fresh air kind of a way. It's like, yeah, adult men, adult women have sex, and why can't I talk about that in common parlance? And I should give a little background. You are so involved in making good progress and giving good factual information about PrEP. So you are, you have a very strong interest in the HIV epidemic and talking about harm reduction messaging in that arena. I'm going to shut up now. Will you talk a little bit about that and your work there? And also, while you're at it, maybe that can lead into you explaining why maybe you're so interested or got so interested in harm reduction, vaping, and things like that.
Sure. Okay, so I'll try to.
Let's just play. Yeah. Just go down that road, and we'll bump into something logical.
Well, thank you. I honestly, I sincerely appreciate that. So I really do value that feedback from you, and especially with your work, I'm honored to hear that. And being a kid of the 80s and the Nancy Reagan and the Reagan conservatism, that just say no to sex, just say no to drugs. And then on top of that, having the pandemic of AIDS and growing up with that and starting to realize that I had feelings, sexual desires that literally could kill me as a teenager. And at that moment in 1985, AIDS was a deadly virus for which we had no real prevention or treatment. So, and at that time in this country, the message was this was just gay men who were dying, which Largely it was, not only, but largely it was in this country, not in the rest of the world. So growing up with all of that, it was just like, okay, don't do drugs, don't be gay, don't have sex, don't have any fun. And realizing the hard way that those messages were not accurate nor sustainable, that there was a way to be gay, there was a way to express myself sexually with other men that would be less likely to result in death. And at that time, the only way was condoms, but knowing that condoms and latex barriers could prevent the transmission of HIV. Okay. Being able to drink alcohol and know that if you don't drive a car or you don't, that you're less likely to be putting yourself in dangerous situations, that you may actually have an experience that could be fun and not have to pay for that with your life. As I got older, experimenting with other drugs, realizing that oftentimes drugs were a conduit by which I could learn things that I didn't know, that I could have experiences that I wouldn't have had otherwise, that enhanced my day-to-day sober life. And realizing that all those messages that I got from Nancy Reagan and society were shit. They were all just like, why did I listen to that? Because I didn't know any better. But as someone now who works in education and psychology, saying that if we equip human beings with intelligent tools and facts in order to enhance pleasure and reduce harm, you will improve outcomes in a community, in a society. That if you explain to people, if we explained to people back then how condoms work, and eventually we did do this, and I was doing a lot of work in this in the 90s, that people could have sex, they could have connection and reduce rates of HIV. Now, for the last 8-9 years, my message has been about an HIV prevention tool called PrEP. PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. That's the medical title. I say it's proactive, responsible, empowered pleasure. Because
I like that so much more.
PrEP is a daily pill a person who is HIV negative can take in order to reduce and pretty much make the possibility of getting HIV zero, even when they're not using condoms, even when they're exposed to HIV from a partner, that I take every day so that if HIV enters my body, I do not become HIV positive. I will not get the virus. That is a harm reduction strategy. This is actually almost harm elimination in this example. But I started using this in 2011 and started thinking, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I can have the sex I want to have without condoms and not have to pay for it, not get HIV because of it. This is amazing. Why isn't everyone taking this drug? And at the time, it was like, well, because no one knows about this drug. So I started saying, all right, it's not the 90s anymore. You don't need an organization or an agency or a budget to get the word out. All you need is a Wi-Fi connection and coffee. And I probably don't even really need the coffee all that much. So I started getting really involved in using social media to help teach adults and adolescents. It's approved for adolescents now as well, that if you are sexually active and if you're like me and you enjoy receptive anal sex without condoms and you like that feeling and that's meaningful and important to you, you can do that and reduce one of the most important consequences from that, which would be HIV transmission. That PrEP will prevent that on more than 99% of the occasions. That is a harm reduction message. And you may know, and I'm sure people know, there was a pretty large backlash to that 8 years ago. I think people now are much more on board with that message now that we have FDA approval and the CDC talks about this and recommends this. It's been with us for nearly a decade. I think people are more acclimated to that idea. But I think, and that was when my message of joy and pleasure and empowerment started to become something that people were more aware of. And I started to be able to do more media and write more about that. The underlying message of all of that, whether we're talking about drug use or alcohol use or sex or anything that someone enjoys, is that there's ways to experience pleasure in this world in a physical, tactile, erotic, sensational way that is less likely to result in consequences that are going to be emotionally or physically painful or detrimental. And if we just start from that and build on that. When I talk to doctors about this, especially conservative doctors, I say, I'm going to be really transparent with you. Here, we're going to start with this baseline. Here's the baseline. Sex is beautiful. Human connection is healthy. And physical consensual touch is necessary. So let's start from there. That's going to be where we're at the baseline. And from there, we're going to talk about ways people can enjoy that experience and reduce the possibility of harm.
Do you think people are resistant to it in part, at least because they may not have ever had to think about what life might be like feeling robbed of those things? Like, if I'm a straight man and I haven't had to worry very well, okay. When I talked to you, admittedly, I knew there were prophylactic drugs that at least I didn't think really eliminated to the extent that it does, but at least protected against STDs and HIV. But I didn't know what Truvada was or PrEP was. I didn't know any. I was completely illiterate in the topic until you told me, and I realized as you were talking. It actually also came after an interview I just did with Johan Hari, and he was talking about. I asked him, "Are you optimistic about actually making changes in the addiction drugs?" He said, "I'm a gay man who went from feeling terrified for my life ever to tell somebody that I had this sexual interest that I do, or wanted to love the people that I do, to watching people in the entire United States be able to be married, gay men and women to be able to be married in the United States. So I'm very optimistic. So I'm already on this like, oh, wow, I have to open my eyes to some of this stuff because I'm a progressive guy, but I have never really thought about the possible pain, trauma people might have gone through. As I was talking to you, you talked about PrEP. I realized, I'm not actively contributing to any kind of a problem, I don't think, but I certainly, I had the luxury of having that be a blind spot. Like I didn't have to be read up or caught up or in the know about those things until I started hearing you talk about the things that were so limiting for you because people have such a poor attitude towards things like prophylactic drugs or enjoying yourself or being gay or something like that. And so that was my question is, when you talk to doctors, like the conservative doctor that you mentioned, do you ever wonder, like, maybe if this guy had a taste of, or, was able to be related to, or could relate to some experience where he wanted something that was life enhancing, life preserving, and really couldn't have it, or was told he couldn't have it, then maybe he'd just maybe be able to connect at a deeper level?
Well, what I try to do in my work is to build empathy when people don't have it. And not necessarily, I don't mean they don't have it because they don't have it. I mean, as you point out, sometimes our privilege stops us from being aware that there's pain and suffering and trauma in the world. I know for me as a white man, I am very unaware a lot of times. And I even wear the shirt, Black Trans Lives Matter, as a reminder, because there's so much of these experiences of being Black, of being trans, that I don't know because I don't have that day-to-day experience, but I want to understand and I want to learn. And when I know better, I think when we know better, we can do better.
Yeah.
And find ways or look for opportunities to be of help. When we can be. But I also understand that no matter what I do, I'm still a white cisgender man, and there's just going to be certain lived experiences that I'm never going to know. That in itself is not bad. That is not, in my opinion, wrong. I don't think privilege is a bad word. But I think what we can do with that, if we so choose to do, is to seek ways that we can be helpers, that we can be allies, that we can be supporters, and as you mentioned, not be perpetuators of the problem. To use our voice, to use our media sources, we have one, to try to spread a deeper level of empathy and understanding. So I get that most straight people have no idea what it's like to grow up thinking that the moment you have sex, you're going to die. And I lived with that for 20 years. I mean, I lived with that possibility of AIDS being a deadly disease that could kill me. In my sexual life, in the most vulnerable sexual intimate moments, always having death in the background. I had that for 20 years until I started using PrEP. I wouldn't expect you to know that. I'm really grateful you don't know that. I'm really grateful that young gay people coming out now won't know that. Because now they know that, first of all, HIV is not a deadly disease, that if someone is diagnosed with HIV today, they're likely, they do not have a life expectancy that's any significantly shorter than my life expectancy. And they also are learning that PrEP is available. If they're HIV negative, they can use PrEP to prevent HIV. And they haven't had the burden of seeing their friends drop dead from AIDS. And that's good. I don't want them to know that. That's what my whole work, I don't want you to know that. That is what my work is about, because I don't want people to know that. So in most ways I'm privileged, but in that ways I'm not. And that's where I do that work, so that hopefully that you and no one has to go through that. Now, tragically and sadly, a lot of people have had that experience in 2020 with COVID because of a different virus that has savagely and cruelly killed people. I don't know, I'm still kind of filtering like what to do with that, but sadly now so many people are in tune with what that's like, to be socializing with your friends and family one Christmas and they're not there the next Christmas.
You have a way about you. Like you could easily take all of that and you would be justified in saying, well, fucking look at me. You have your problems, look at my problems. But that, as you say, I could be more privileged to someone, and that person could be more privileged to someone else, and that scales all the way to infinity. Like, you're taking the mindset, just like I'm happy that my daughter hopefully will never know extreme hunger, as people are experiencing in other countries. You're saying, you want people to be unaware of the experience of suffering in that way. And everything you do sort of trends a positive direction. I feel that when I'm talking to you, and I see that in your interactions too. Because you don't, even though I said all those things and I mean them, I'm not easily persuaded, and I don't think anybody is, by somebody yelling at me that, why the hell aren't you A, B, and C? You seem ultra aware of that. Is that something that you learned, or is that something that's natural? You're just kind of a pretty positive person that just wants joy.
I thank you. And I think that is very intentional. I don't think anyone opens up their mind or opens up their heart when they're feeling judged or condemned, or condescended to. That's just what we tend to do in the central nervous system, is shut off at that point. We shut down, we go into fight or flight, we defend ourselves. And then we're not open to new ideas, and we're not open to learning new experiences or examining our privilege or trying to understand how we can be a catalyst of more loving experiences when we're feeling that reaction. So that's a very intentional part of who I am and the work I do. There is a facet of the gay community that doesn't agree with me on this, that thinks, for those of us who survived some of the worst, and I don't think I even survived the worst of the AIDS crisis, but came through the AIDS crisis believing that it is our role to scream and yell and put people down and condemn people, especially young people, for not having had that experience, and shame people for being sexually active because of what we went through. We went through pain, we went through trauma, therefore everyone else should as well. Notice I'm talking about the shoulds, right? That's why I don't believe in shoulds.
Yes, you wrote a whole book about it. I wish I had yours.
A whole book about the word should. In my experience, if we're serious about being catalysts of healing and health and joy and happiness and growth and helping people have fun and great sex and meaningful drug experiences. That means we have to direct that from that place of humanity, of knowing that we ascend when we are better. When you're healthier, I'm healthier. When your child is healthier, the world is healthier, that we are interconnected in that way. And we're going to do better, and the next generation is going to do better by understanding humanity in a loving way. But that can't be drilled into somebody. You can't make someone have those values. The only way people arrive at that, in my experience, is to receive information and education from a place of compassion and respect, especially when I'm talking to doctors who don't have that experience, or when I'm talking to people who generally have more societal privilege. It doesn't do good to say, you terrible white guy, you should be sensitive, you should know this, da, da, da. It helps to say, who do you want to be? What are your values? And if you wish to be a catalyst of healing, of growth, and correcting some injustice in this world, here are some ways that you could do that and learn more so you can know what to do and how to do that.
Have you, you said once tongue in cheek, but more or less serious actually, that some of your friends think you're conservative. You're like a liberal guy, like pushing for harm reduction and trying to educate the public about it. But you said just in passing, I mean, geez, my friends think I'm conservative. Is that why? Is that what you mean by that? Is that you will associate with and befriend people who are not historically sympathetic to you or communities that you've traveled in?
I think when I said that was during the presidential primaries, in which it.
Oh, that's right. I fucked up the context. Yeah.
Okay. I remember it's just like, I was taking all these quizzes online, like, who do you support? And overall, my values seem to be aligned with Biden. And I thought some of Biden's things compared to when I was growing up were pretty radical. Compared to even 10 years ago when Obama, or 12 years ago when Obama was running, some of Biden's ideas about healthcare and gay marriage, and protecting trans rights and Black Lives Matter, to me, those are progressive steps in the correct direction. But I learned that a lot of people on the left, that I am more like in the middle now, like that's kind of middle to where a lot of other people are. That some people might see my values as conservative now, which is a little surprising. But I guess that's also, I try to learn from that. I'm trying to grow from that. I'm trying to see, well, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing? Maybe they are maybe they have a better vision or a better expansive vision of the future than I do. Or they're allowing themselves to dream a little more than I'm dreaming. But I also think I'm a realist. I think being alive in this world and being politically aware for almost 50 years has taught me, well, what I would call reality is that change is incremental. And we can progress in an incremental way, in a loving way, but it doesn't like happen leaps and bounds in a diverse country. We can do that in small echelons, in small liberal echelons. We may grow leaps and bounds and arrive in a very different position. But when you're dealing with the federal level and we're dealing with policy change, I have seen change happen more incrementally, and it's definitely not linear either. But if anything else, I think to justify my position, just look at the election results. I mean, Biden won very clearly, but it was still way close. You look at the popular vote, that was way close.
Yeah. And you have to live with, that 70-something million people that voted for Trump. It's not like we could just ignore them.
Right.
That's half of us.
And I am curious now, over the next few years, what am I trying to say? How we apply these ideas that you and I are talking about. Talking with people with compassion, with empathy, being willing to learn, being willing to understand. Can we build some bridges between these two extremes? Now, again, some people on the left would say I'm crazy for asking that, and maybe I'm too, I'm too conservative for thinking this. But I really believe we have more in common than different.
I agree.
And I've been in Georgia the last month canvassing for John Ossoff and Reverend Raphael Warnock in the runoffs. and having conversations with people, often on the left, but some on the right, and just seeing, when you get down to it, we have so much more in common than different. You know, we want to raise children and have them have a better life than we've had. We want to have a safe home and running water. And, you know, we want to reliably know where our next meal is going to come from day to day, year to year. That's basically what most people want. Let's start from there. Like, in my opinion, like all those 70 million plus Trump voters, it's like at least some of them, I think, would be amenable to sitting down and saying, let's look at all the things we have in common. Is there any way that we can take this dichotomized nation right now, and for the sake of the next generation and the next generation, find some way to get our shit together so we can make changes that is going to enhance the quality and quantity of the future? That's what I'm about. Now, some people would say I'm crazy and conservative for that, and that's okay. They can think whatever. I don't mind.
What are you seeing when you're talking to people in Georgia? I mean, are you talking to any ultra conservative people who, you know, by and large, you know, when you check all the boxes, amazingly have extremely similar views and values to you? It's just that they box it up a little bit differently.
So largely no. And the reason for that is that I've been able to have the great honor of volunteering with the New Georgia Project Action Fund. And they basically have this very sophisticated system where you download a list and they tell you which doors to knock on. And generally they have you interacting with voters who are either registered Democrats or registered independent or undecided.
Gotcha. Yep. That makes sense.
You know, we're really not there to get into debates or fights, but occasionally I do get someone who is, you know, voting and really thinks that Trump is God. And I try to understand what that's about. Generally, what I think is that it's not even so much about the issues, it's about the personality. It's the tribalism. And I'm saying that in a way that I can relate to. Is that people want to feel a sense of belonging. They want to feel like their life matters. They want to feel that they're part of a community and their community thinks that they're a valuable contributor. That is what I get from the Trump folks. That is now, you know, and again, I'm not defending any of it. I'm not defending the pedagogy and the racism and the culture and the homophobia, but I try to go deeper than that and say, but what is that really about? Like, what is he offering to these people that they still voted for him after everything?
You're giving the benefit of the doubt that there are things that are that could be heinous about a political candidate, especially running for president, that on either side, you have to value something else enough to overlook what seems like should be a deal breaker for anybody else. And Trump is no exception to that. I mean, he's an exceptionally strange phenomenon in and of itself, but the idea that he could do things that, you know, that should make people write him off, you would think, but they have some sort of a value that says, yeah, but we need him for this. It's not like a new strange phenomenon. It's kind of common sense, it seems.
Right. And well, also that's why I don't believe it should, because I can't tell people what to prioritize or how to prioritize. But it's just like we were saying at the beginning, the very tenets of harm reduction is meeting people where they're at. And seeing if you have the ability to participate in a process of moving the needle a little bit, maybe just a tiny, tiny bit. You know, 30 years ago, when I came out of the closet, homophobia was a lot more rampant in this country. And a lot of my volunteer work was when I was in college, was participating in undermining homophobia workshops, with the knowledge being that if I walk into your dorm and you have a conversation with me, it's going to make it much harder for you to hate me. And if you don't hate me quite so much, you may decide not to hate other gay people. And so I'm going to use this meeting with you to find a bond that's going to make it harder for you to practice homophobia in your day-to-day life. I feel like I have an opportunity that we have an opportunity on both the left and the right to meet each other and say, it's going to be harder for you to hate me if we can look each other in the eye and say that we have similar values. And what I have learned from harm reduction is that Again, you meet someone where they're at, you respect how they've arrived at where they are, all the trials and tribulations and traumas that have led them to be where they are today, including the resilience that has led them to be where they are today. And then maybe you can change their thinking, or change or have them question some of their values, some of their decisions, some of their priorities. Maybe.
Let me reflect that. It's like, whether it's drugs or lifestyles or choices or political persuasions, people have some sorts of reasons for believing what they do. And if they're doing something out of, or believing something out of ignorance, then you're taking on this perspective that they're not actually so much a threat as it's almost like they're the lackeys. You have to, if you can be empathetic with them and see them as, look, I kind of feel for you. You don't have some of the knowledge or experience that I know you could. And not that you're better or know more about everything, but like, you're a gay man. So if there's somebody who says, well, I hate all gay people, and you say, pretty likable, that you're taking the perspective that you should get to know me. You should figure out what it is that you're saying. You're grouping human beings in this category, this abstract category in your mind, but I don't think you really have some lived experience. So you're using all of this as just being able to educate. And I think you see it as, and correct me if I'm wrong, but not just a passion, but an obligation.
To me, it's an intention. And it's been an intention that's been consistent throughout my whole life. I'm almost 50. I'm almost there.
That's unbelievable.
And
I always, yeah.
And I'm really excited about that. I'm really, actually, really, really high. I wasn't sure I was going to make it. But I'm really excited about that. And I'm excited what that means in the gay community. We don't have a lot of role models. We don't have a lot of generations of gay men who have lived this long with this level of social acceptance, relatively speaking, legal protection, medical advancements. Very, very sadly, most of the cohort above me died of AIDS. And so role models are few and far between. And what that means is that my generation, those of us that are in our 50s and 60s, are kind of creating the blueprint here for what it means to be an empowered gay person, politically, spiritually, sexually, in a way that's never been done before. And so I feel like if I get an opportunity to live that and share that and help other people understand how they can enjoy life, then it is my responsibility to live that. I believe that with PrEP. I believe that 30 years ago when I started volunteering in HIV prevention and talking about condoms and helping college campus students unlearn homophobia and all the things. I mean, I guess that's just always been one of my values. Basically, my premise is like to leave this fucked up world a better place than how I found it.
That's a good premise.
Yeah.
That pretty much does it all. Yeah, we talked a little bit before we started recording, and I told you that I have clients who are gay and who, it's almost like, we'll get in conversations. Well, I would like to change this behavior. I can't seem to reduce, I seem to be reducing dissonance in this area. And, I'm pretty good at talking people through that and talking about, well, what are the resources at your disposal? What are your values? Are you really living them? Why not? Why or why not? But then it gets to the part about just community and what I told you that everyone has their own kind of way of saying, that's cute that you think that, but I guess you don't really understand the gay community. I said that and it seemed like it was interesting to you. So I think I don't even need to get more detailed. What do you think is going on there?
Well, again, so I think there's a lot of things that we have in common and a lot of things that are different. What I think can be different for gay men in general, and this is a huge generalization, is this sort of juxtaposition of wanting connection, but knowing that we are, and knowing often at an early age before we have language, that we're different and that we're an outsider. And we're different in a way that could threaten our sense of safety within our own families. And a lot of gay men even today still pay that price, and women and people who have lived trans experience pay that price for being who we are, knowing that it can threaten family relationships. It can threaten community. And at the same time, and I'm just going to speak from the gay male, cisgender male experience, that there is also often a sexuality that can be quite celebratory. But where that can become problematic is when we don't know how to communicate and ask for touch, or to be held, or to be embraced without fucking being part of it. We don't really know how to articulate that. Men in general don't know how to articulate and ask for being touched and held in a really, really precious, genuine, loving way. We generally tend to associate that with sex in some way. And in the gay community, we sexualize things to the point that sometimes extinguishes the intimacy we seek, so that everything becomes about fucking. Now, again, I love fucking, and I'm all about fucking, and I'm all about wonderful consensual fucking with as many people as you want. But I'm also about people making sure that they're attending to their needs for touch, for intimacy, for human connection. What I have found in COVID, especially with so much fear, is that some of the sexual partners that I would have, that I, would just sometimes just have a purely sexual exchange with, a lot during COVID just wanted more touch. They just kind of wanted a man's arms around them and hold them to say, we'll get through this. We're going to be okay. And it reminded me of how much we crave that. And as men, often how difficult it is to ask for that. So in the gay community, you have that confusion between the joy and the fun of sexuality, sometimes being deprived of intimacy and connection, no way to communicate that, and being part of a stigmatized group that has separated you from society, from family, that says you're this dirty sinner, pathological, whatnot. And many people resolve that dilemma by turning to drugs and crystal meth as a way to kind of have all of the above without the fear, to be able to engage in sexuality in a way, and often in groups for long periods of time, where all of this dissonance is gone. And the only focus is the pleasure sensation. Now, again, I'm a harm reductionist. So in and of itself, I'd say, well, that in and of itself doesn't have to be problematic.
Meth use or sexual experiences, neither of those have to be problematic, right?
Sexual experiences by themselves, done responsibly and intentionally and consciously, need not become problematic. But because we don't have these conversations anywhere, and especially not in the gay community, you send people often on a path where they become dependent on using crystal meth to have the intimacy and touch and sexuality that they want to experience, that they haven't given themselves permission to ask for without crystal meth. So there's trauma involved. There's that trauma that a lot of gay men carry of knowing that we're different at an early age, and sometimes having that reinforced in childhood through violence. And there's just not a lot of resources for, at least 30, 40 years ago, and a lot of resources for young gay people who are traumatized. So we carry that into adulthood, and it doesn't go away. It often gets processed through drug use. And, again, nothing wrong with drugs, but that's really not the best tool by itself to work through trauma and abuse.
So correct me, if I'm getting any of it wrong, but what resonates with me about all that you said is that, okay, because there's not a good language, or perhaps any, at a population level, great role modeling, or, models to follow at all, really, the gay community can, generalization, over-rely on sex as a way of achieving all sorts of things. Touch being one, intimacy being another, just sort of a connection with another person. But it could be problematic because if you're a person who just wants to engage in sex, then it can be tough to know the back and forth. Is that what the other person wants or not? If you're a person who just wants intimacy but not sex, it's really difficult to explain that or talk about that or be involved in the community and feel like you're okay with saying that. Meth and other drugs are ways of being able to sort of feel uninhibited to ask or need those things But then that can be it's kind of insidious, because not only are you over relying on a sexual experience to solve more problems than it can, but you maybe are over relying on a drug to make you feel comfortable being able to solve more problems. It's sort of just like a one then the other, but the relationships with both of those things could be problematic.
Right. That's very perfect synopsis, and again, all of that. And again, in the gay community, as a stigmatized group, there tends to be, in many facets of the gay community, a fair amount of attack and criticism and homophobia within the gay community, with the way people treat each other, with the things they say to each other, the way people taunt, and mock each other, and hurt each other with their words. The allure of crystal meth is that you don't have that generally at these parties, at these events that can go on for days on end, where it's just about naked bodies getting together and people getting high and not being mean to each other. So that is often what my clients have told me is so alluring and addicting and so triggering once they stop using meth, was that experience almost of symbiosis and a group full of naked men who are just being naked and good to each other and feeling high. Yes, because amphetamines do make you feel high, but just that basic idea that I belong here. I belong right now in this room with this group of people who are being affectionate to each other. That is often what is so tempting about that experience that gay men have on crystal meth that I have not heard my straight clients describe in quite the same way.
Belonging and love being something that you'd want to achieve, but maybe it's not actual, it's not taking all the proper steps to having that sustainable sort of a feeling. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Belonging and feeling sexually empowered and being able to ask for what you want without shame or inhibition. So what my work with a lot of these folks are like, okay, are there ways to experience that without meth?
Right.
Can that be part of the continuum of human experience, is to be empowered as a sexual being, to ask for what you want, to ask for the kind of sex you want to have, the fucking you want to have, as well as the times that you don't necessarily want to fuck. You just want to feel a man's arms around you and hold you. Can we talk about ways to get that, to ask for that? To have that.
You say fucking, and it doesn't sound dirty. You say it just spaz. But how is it that that you can do that so seamlessly and still like I have no inherent judgment about you for using it. The word fucking is sort of it has some strong connotations usually.
Because to me, it's beautiful. Like, I think you can feel the energy around that word.
Yeah.
That word. I love it can mean a lot of things in a lot of contexts, but to me, it's just like, I don't like intercourse. I just think of fucking as like this wonderful, beautiful thing that human beings can experience and connect and make this crazy experience and the pain of this world something that makes the human experience meaningful within the context of the pain that we're going to deal with in this world, that we are probably going to have more of in the years ahead, I'm sorry to say. But that connection and touch and fucking and connecting are ways that we're going to get through this, that we can get through this stronger, that we can get this more through this more holistically, that we're going to survive this virus, the COVID pandemic, as well as perhaps some of the difficult struggles we're going to have ahead. So another thing I've learned in 50 years is that things are going to get better, and then things are going to get worse, and then things are going to get better, and things are going to get worse. And the way that things are going to get worse are not things I can predict. So there's no point in worrying about it because I can't predict it. No one could predict COVID. We could imagine all the terrible catastrophic things that are going to happen. And I did a lot of that the first 30 years of my life and lost a lot of sleep and did a lot of drugs to try to manage fear about what was going to happen. And then came to understand I can't fucking predict what's going to happen. Oh, see, I said it a different way there. It's silly to predict it. So instead of trying to predict something that's going to happen, why don't I just invest in my coping skills and my ability to process trauma and fear and pain. And then if and when something really horrible does happen, perhaps I can show up for that in a way that is a win-win, that helps me and helps others. And I feel like that for me is what COVID has been about. This has been, in many ways a very painful year, but I must say that I'm very proud of who I have been during this year as a friend, as a human being, as a therapist. I'm very proud of that. And I don't think I could have said the same thing if this had happened when I was 30.
This is going to lead into the final topic pretty well, but I'm curious. You have everything you said is just such a stoic perspective and like an Albert Ellis-ish perspective. So is that where no shoulds comes from for you?
So the shoulds thing is derivative of cognitive behavioral, and Albert Ellis funded rational emotive behavioral therapy. And I did know him, and I still know his wife. His wife wrote the foreword for rational relating. So,
oh my God, I didn't realize that.
His wife, Debbie Ellis, wrote that.
Oh, wow.
Based on Albert Ellis's work. But it's my spin on that, on connection and joyful and polyamory, using rational emotive behavioral tools. So that's just a little preview there. But I will tell you this, Zach, I grew up extremely, for many reasons, depressed. And I was an extremely anxious kid. I was extremely depressed. I was extremely lonely and really was quite suicidal, and almost really made a serious move towards suicide when I was 11. By the way, that's an absolutely Shouldless, the first one. But I didn't. And some of the ways I survived the situation I was in was to just sort of shut off and become stoic. Say, okay, no emotions, all rationality. And I just sort of checked out. But it was a functional way to get through my childhood and teens.
And you did that part with no prompting? That was just sort of what you did?
It was just, yeah. It wasn't conscious. I can say it clearly now, but at the time I didn't have a conscious awareness of that. It was just like, at a certain point, I was like, I do describe the moment. I was going to walk in front of moving traffic on Overland Avenue in Culver City. And something propelled me to say, don't do this. If you have the power to end it, you have the power to fight, to stay and to fight. So stay here and fight. And that to me was spirit. That to me was my inner power, my spirit, my outer power saying, fuck all this. Don't give them the power. If you die, they're going to take that power. So it's like, don't give it to them. Mm. Later, when I went to school in Santa Cruz, California, I had a bit of an emotional meltdown of sorts, kind of many, many years of suppressed emotions just kind of came out like a big beach ball. And at a certain point, I realized the only thing, if I'm really going to step up and be healthy here, the only thing that has really hurt me are my shoulds. That I should be masculine, that I should be straight, that I should be smarter than who I am, that I should be different than who I am, that I should have a more manly body than what I have. I just, like, every fucking should that had hurt me throughout my childhood and teenage years that I had internalized and processed in a way and believed in and invested in, that is what almost killed me. And it was so simple. And it came to me on May 17th, 1990. It was just sort of like this very simple thing that said, if I could change the should, I can change the way I feel. So I made a challenge to myself. I put a sign around my neck that said no shoulds, very much like the cover. I actually made a little handheld sign that said, like, no shoulds with a sign. I wore it around my neck, and I told everyone for a week that I wasn't going to use should. And this was Santa Cruz, California, so everyone, thought that was pretty groovy. And by the end of the week, lo and behold, I felt really good. I was like, oh, I think I'm onto something here. Later on, I actually learned. I didn't know anything about cognitive behavioral therapy or Albert Ellis back then. But later on, as I studied psychology and learned more about the cognitive behavioral realm of psychology, I learned that there was actually a whole academic school of thought around the word should as one of many distorted patterns of thinking that leads to suicide and drug abuse and depression and violence and anger. And that if we could correct and explore those cognitive distortions, that we have the opportunity to live life in a more joyful, meaningful way. And I was like, whoa, there's my should thing right there. But no one had actually written a book about the word should, and how homophobia and racism and misogyny informs the shoulds that we carry in our own mind.
Then for every should, there is a shouldn't, right? So
Yeah.
that for every should, there's like, I shouldn't this, I should something instead.
Yeah. Like, you know, it's the converse, like, I should be more masculine. Well, you shouldn't be feminine. I should be straight. Well, you shouldn't be gay. I should be athletic. You shouldn't sit at home watching soap operas all day. You know, it was like this whole thing, and all of them piled on, right? But all of that really changed for me when I was 19. No, I just turned 19 and started to say, I'm having a lot of feelings, and I was having a lot of pain from my past, from my childhood. But that if I am going to live through this, and I am going to find meaning in this, and I'm going to work hard to make this fucked up world a better place than how I found it, it begins by changing the shoulds. And it literally, I think, helped to save my life. And as I continue to talk about this with friends, and as a therapist, as I continue to talk about this with clients, I found that that was a tool that always seemed to help improve people's mood on the spot. Just to change the shoulds, and then change their relationships, and change their opinions of themselves. And if they were coping with something systemic related to homophobia or racism or sexism, that they could change their own processing of that by changing the should around the oppressive beliefs that accompanied those isms.
That's remarkable. That's because it really does, that changes a belief system that's core to you.
And what's implicit in that, what's underneath all of that, is the challenging of power, of systems or people, places or things that tell you you're not okay.
Right. Yeah. So I knew that I knew there must be a story like that behind that, but because you could have chosen any sort of concept from like the Stoics or from REBT or cognitive behavior therapy and written a book about it. But I was curious why that one. That's beautiful. That's beautiful that it's something that you found on your own and was reinforced by what actually turned out to be a revolutionary body of work that said that you can do things like this. That's cool.
That, to me, there was so much liberation in there. And once again, we liberate our minds and we start to do that work within ourselves, we're in a position to help others be liberated from their shoulds, from their internal processing, to challenge and change the systems that are oppressing and hurting them.
Stanton and I wrote a book. We were going to write a book that was called, it was something like Count Me Out of Recovery Nation. And first of all, that principle was completely, I should abstain from drugs, or I shouldn't X, Y, Z. And just the idea that a culture is telling us to do things that are clearly antithetical to our preferences. We didn't do that because we had marketing for this program that we're doing, Life Process Program. And it turned out, this is just one of the reasons, to be relevant on Google search terms for a program that helps people with addiction, you're going to need to use the word recovery. And so we're like, we don't mind it. Like the word itself, the Samson definition of recovery, fine. So we use it a lot, and we've pivoted from that book of Count Me Out of Recovery Nation, because that would seem a little silly to write a book like that and then have the word recovery all over. You had, and I see where you're going with this. Tell me what the word you used instead, and you'll probably make fashionable soon.
I definitely understand the need to have a book title that's Googleable, because I did learn the hard way that nobody is Googling the word shouldless.
Yeah.
I made it up. It made sense at the time. I wrote it before I had any understanding of the internet. And it's not something that's it won't organically come up in a Google search. So I understand that's important. But as a therapist, I am weary of the term recovery.
Me too.
Because what that says to me, and what I feel like a lot of the 12 Steps group encourage, is a recovering of what led to destructive drug use or harmful drug use in the first place. So an example I gave earlier with gay men and crystal meth, if one is led to abuse crystal meth in a way, and that's being fueled by painful trauma and homophobia that's internalized, and then they stop using crystal meth and they go to meetings, and this whole idea is that you recover. To me, that's like saying you're recovering your wounds, you're recovering the trauma instead of actually looking at that. So my phrase is discovery, not recovery. If we're going to discover new ways to be in the world for gay men, we're going to discover new ways to be sexual, to be empowered, to ask for what you want, to be connected as a community, to create family. Even if you have a biological family, we can still be actively creating family in our lives. But let's discover what you like. Let's discover what's meaningful, what brings peace into your life, what brings purpose into your life, what brings pleasure into your life. Let's discover that, because that, if we look at that the right way, is going to be an ongoing process throughout our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. That's going to be an ongoing process of discovering who we are at a greater level, which I think can be quite joyful. But if we're just going to recover, and we're going to recover those wounds, and we're going to recover that pain and just focus on behavior, that to me is really short-sighted and limited.
We quote in the book all the time the work of Marty Seligman, who is just gung-ho about prospection. Looking at a hopeful future is just really a key feature of what makes and keeps people happy in every regard, joyful and happy in every regard. And so what you're saying really resonates with me when we talk about recovering. There's just something about that says you have to address this past part of yourself. And it's not that you can't think about your past like it's your prologue. It's you. But there is even like the Samson definition, home, hell, where it invites those concepts to just be assimilated in the standard sort of 12-step B kind of boxes. I love the way that you pivot. You're really good with those linguistic changes, but it's not just like a silly or like a cute little trick. Should versus any other word that you could use that empowers yourself. Discovery instead of recovery. Those are really meaningfully different ways of speaking about these phenomena. So I have to think about it, how I'm gonna implement that, but I really want to. I really love the idea of using a different word other than recover, rather than saying a word that could mean so many different things, and that maybe that would tackle a lot of my problems.
Well, so what if this was a process, an ongoing, lifelong process of uncovering and discovering greater depths and appreciation for who you are as a body, as a mind, as a spirit?
That already is how I look at the work that I do on myself and for people with people in addiction. That's what I mean. That entire thing makes sense.
Right. And I know for me in my life, drugs have been sometimes a conduit of that learning. In cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about the as if experience. Have you heard that phrase?
Yeah.
It's if someone's uncomfortable going into a bar by themselves, that we sort of have an as if. Let's walk into that bar as if you're hot shit, as if that you got it going on, like the Fonz. Well, now that's a dated reference, but you've got it, you've got cool going on, you've got sexiness going on. You have an as if experience, because more often than not, if you walk in with that energy, you will create an experience that will nurture that and sustain that. It will become a fulfilling prophecy in a very positive way.
Right.
Drugs, in my experience, can give us an as if experience. Drugs, for me specifically, MMDA, got me through a lot of depression and pain from my childhood. I had a lot of awkwardness about being, not homophobia about being gay, but just like awkwardness about being social. And had so much fears of inadequacy and thinking I was like this ugly piece of shit and I had nothing to say and I wasn't attractive. And it was really through some very intentional experiences with MMDA. We called it ecstasy back then. in my early 20s that I began to have experiences of confidence and connection and sort of recognizing this interconnectivity with all people in a room, all people in a club, in a bar, that we are all this interconnected energy and spirit. And it was really through MMDA that I had that reality. And I knew it was temporary, but I also knew that there was something there that could help my non-MMDA life, that could make everyday experiences easier, that I didn't have to keep questioning or thinking that I'm like this ugly, gross piece of shit, that I could really recognize that like, oh, wait, I am a good person. I am empowered. I am wonderful. You're a good person. You are empowered. You're wonderful. Isn't this wonderful?
Drugs unlocked that experience for you. Like,
absolutely.
I see what you're saying. That's how I would love all of us to think about drugs and just experiences in general, that if you have an experience that you love, no matter how you got there, and it's a new experience, you've just hacked something. You've just said, wow, this is possible. And it's almost certain that there's not only one way to get there.
Yeah. And by the way, full circle, it was, I learned a lot of this before I ever touched a drug, other than alcohol, through a drugs and society course I had taken in Santa Cruz that Staten Peel was largely featured in. And I think, oh yeah, here it is. This was the text we used.
Oh my God.
You know, this was like, and I still refer to this all the time. This was like essays that I got back in 1992, but I think this came out in the 60s. But it talks so much about this idea of what drug use can be if we're intentional and conscious about doing that. And I still use these ideas today with gay men and crystal meth if abstinence is not their goal. It's like, if abstinence is not your goal, then how can we be intentional about beginning and ending, about knowing your limits, about saying, I'm going to start at this point and I'm going to stop at this point, and I'm going to still drink water, and I'm not going to lose my keys and my phone in this process, and I'm going to do everything I can to be reasonably safe and take PrEP if that is something that helps me to do that. But it was a lot from Staten Peel and his work, as well as the essays in this book back in 1992, that helped me to understand how I could use my own drug experiences for healing and growth.
That's amazing.
Full circle there.
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of work with kids, and that's how I started. That's how I met Stanton. I talked about, child development the same way he talked about addiction, and he made the connection. And I think about how, people are sort of getting on to this idea that we're not letting kids play enough, without the existential fear that something horrible could possibly happen to them. And it's like, yeah, it is true. Something horrible, however low the odds, could happen to a kid that you let play freely, more so than if you locked them in a box. And we're realizing, I think, through COVID and for other reasons, just watching kids grow up and seeing some of the damage that can do, that it's not, you can't just lock someone in a box. You have to let people live their lives and experience things. And it's what you're saying about drugs and experiences in general, is that if we have sort of mandates, regulations, ideas, beliefs about how people achieve their experiences, we make them completely off limits, rather than saying, what are the harmful effects of choosing one way or another in a context, then we're robbing people of the ability to do what you just said that you did with MDMA, figuring out that something really valuable to you in your life is possible. So I think that's a really nice way of going about that, which is, again, why something like discovery instead of recovery, it just seems like that's a logical way of explaining that whole phenomenon.
And here's my optimism, but rational. In the medical community, in the psychiatric community, I believe we are slowly but consistently moving toward that pathway of understanding the value of certain drugs in mental health and healing.
Mm.
We're seeing more and more data that supports the use of psilocybin in treating certain kinds of depression.
Yeah.
I believe we're seeing more and more data that's showing the effective role of ketamine in treating certain kinds of trauma and PTSD. And this isn't just, like you and me talking about this. There's actually science and data going on that's happening now that appears to be supporting this more and more. And I think that when we have the medicine, the science, and the ideas, and the humanity, that's where society starts to evolve and change. I mean, the change I've seen around marijuana in the last 30 years, from Nancy Reagan's shit to where we are today, is huge. And that really shows to me that society, American society, can grow and evolve and change incrementally when there's science and rationale, and then eventually laws that support that. I believe we will see more respect for these experiences over time as psilocybin. Am I saying that right? Psilocybin?
I say psilocybin, but I'm probably pronouncing it wrong.
Psilocybin and ketamine and perhaps other drugs do give us more insights into the mental, spiritual enhancements that they can offer when they are being offered in setting in controlled, supportive, responsible ways. I had the great honor of being invited by a personal friend, not in a professional capacity, but in a personal capacity, to be a guide for a friend of mine who was treating his depression with psilocybin or whatever. He came to me and he explained it to me, and I didn't know much about it, but he explained that he wanted to have this experience. He had already had two. They were incrementally helping him to deal with depression, and he is a father and wanted not to be a depressed father, and antidepressants had failed for him miserably. So he asked me to be a guide for him, and I said sure. And I was really honored that I got to be there and got to witness that. We talked about it before and we debriefed afterwards, and it has continued to enhance his experience of being the human being and the father and the husband he wants to be. And that to me was up close to a personal experience of seeing psilocybin really does have what I could see a therapeutic effect.
My favorite concept right now, besides that happening, a colleague of mine and a friend of mine, his name's Rick Barnett. He's a psychologist here in Vermont. He was a total abstinence-oriented guy for a while. He was one of the first now to have been trained, to have taken these courses through Johns Hopkins and et cetera, to be a psychologist once it's legal to prescribe psilocybin and MDMA to his clients. So that's been a really cool window that I see opening where people are changing their minds on this and really breaking. Yeah. Carl Hart has his book out, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, it's called. And he's my favorite. He talks about drug exceptionalism. So it's like the gripe he makes in his book is that good thing this is happening. Now, all the anti for drugs or any kind of experience being okay shouldn't be that it's so completely awe-inspiring or life-altering. It's nice. It would be nice if we could take that concept and generalize it to say maybe any drug could just give an effect. His quote was he was giving a talk here in Burlington. He said that he admitted to the crowd that he uses heroin. Chair of psychology at Columbia University. He's like, yeah, I use heroin from time to time. People, and I know where to get it. So there's pure. And sometimes I have to go to functions with boring ass people in colleges. And when I do it, it just helps me. It's nothing profound. And I get through the night. So hope that we can take that concept and just extrapolate to all of human experience at some point. I know that you're a guy who believes in, I think truly, because I believe it too, that things will happen incrementally, but I still hold out for that time to come along where everybody says, nah, all drugs are okay.
Well, I think there's still the addictive industry is not going to let go of their
never
model, and they do have a lot of money and power. So I think there will be resistance purely on that front, as well as the morality. But again, I do think the morality is changing based on what I've seen with the social acceptance and legalization of marijuana, and CBD, and just how natural that seems to be now. that you can go somewhere, a legitimate shop, and purchase a product that you want to consume, and the cops aren't going to come down and bust you for that. That says to me that there is a willingness to adapt in our society, which is one of the reasons why I'm hopeful that people can have that, and hopefully we'll be able to have these experiences in therapeutic ways. The one thing I know, I've been working as a therapist for almost 25 years now, and I am obviously a huge fan of therapy, but I do know that sometimes it's limited, that sometimes talk therapy in and of itself is limited, that if there isn't an experiential component to it, sometimes the work is really limited that you can do with someone. And, I cannot, within my license, my scope of practice in New York, I cannot recommend someone use a drug. But if they bring it up, we can certainly talk about it. And sometimes I will recommend a movie or something, and that will stir a conversation. But I definitely can't prescribe it. I can't recommend it. And I don't. There's often you don't know always how that's going to go down, like what kind of experience, so it's
you can't recommend anything for anyone, really. It's you don't seem to be the kind of guy who says that someone ought to do something because that goes against your book. But
certainly, we have talked about in my practice, how or if conscious enhancing tools can be something that could promote healing and growth and help them have that as if experience that they just cannot get to on their own.
You are so kind with your time. I'm scared to look at the clock right now, but I want to say you have and we're up late. This is now that I have a 2-year-old. This is later than I'm usually up. But all right, Damon.
Pleasure talking with you, Zach.
A great pleasure talking to you too. And what can I link people to if they say, I'm going to find everything Damon Jacobs?
So DamonLJacobs.com is probably the best way. DamonLJacobs.com.
And that takes you everywhere?
What's that?
And that'll take you anywhere they want to go?
Yeah. So it goes to my page, and then people can see the books if they want to, or the prep stuff if they want to, or get in touch with me if they want to.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much. It's always, I don't know why it took me so long to ask you to come on and talk to me again, but it's a real pleasure.